One of the more interesting works of classical Greek literature, at least in my opinion, is Anabasis, Xenophon's recount of the expedition of 10,000 Greek mercenaries into the lands of the Persian Empire. After the guy they were serving is killed, they are betrayed by the Persian emperor. Alone, unsupplied, and deep in hostile territory, the Greeks managed to successfully march their way home, making use of effective tactics, wild deceptions, and some goodwill from the locals to repeatedly dominate the Persians and others that stood in their way. Like all Greek history, it is more than likely that some parts of the story are embellished or made up entirely to make it a better story and paint the Greeks in a certain light. Because, come on, surely it's impossible for a foreign army cut off from its support and betrayed by the masters of the land to successfully wage a fighting retreat against seemingly impossible odds, right? So, funny story. Okay, so 2 pieces of historical context are required before we get into the meat and potatoes of this tale. 1. Trains are cool. That's its own independent thought, but okay, Russia, if you didn't know, is incomprehensibly massive. Being this incomprehensibly massive does come with some issues, especially when this specific massive chunk of this supreme bigness was, for an incredibly long time, worth less than the paper it took to draw the maps. Now, Siberia is actually insanely valuable in an economic sense. Basically every natural resource on Earth of any value can be found here, from timber, iron, nickel, coal, fish, and furs, to oil, gold, diamonds, and other precious metals. The problem with this cornucopia is that it is big and cold and sad. Agriculture is possible, but it is difficult and the growing season is short, meaning the region has a hard cap to the population it can support without significant importation. The land is absolutely covered in dense forests, lakes, rivers, mountains, and hills, and it gets so unbelievably cold in the more northern areas where a lot of the valuable resources are situated. Unless you could reduce both the cost to import the materials required to support development and the cost to export them to European Russia and beyond, Siberia was simply unviable. This also came with a military dimension as well. Russia was fighting wars of expansion in the Far East, coming up against China and Japan. Getting armies over there from the west was absolutely miserable. Rivers could only be used for transport 5 months out of the year, and the rest of the distance had to be covered on foot or on horseback, suffering through the cold and the wildlife. Not only was the land economically unviable, but it was increasingly clear that it would become militarily unviable as well if a large-scale war were to break out in the region. This would not do. Assorted Siberian governors general absolutely understood the value of the region, even if the imperial government in St. Petersburg often did not, due to how fucking expensive getting anything done out there was. So, what's the best way to remedy all of these issues? Railroads. We build railroads. But don't forget, this is Russia. A big country needs a big fucking railroad to showcase its supreme bigness. So they built the longest railway on Earth. After relentless badgering from Far Eastern governors about colonization, as well as the foundation of Vladivostok in 1860, suddenly giving them a major port in the east that would take literal months to get to by sea, and the prospect of cyberbullying China out of more territory in Manchuria sweetening the pot, the government decided to put some effort towards connecting their country. Thus, in 1891, construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway began. The railroad was split into several sections so it could be built faster. Section 1 began in Chelyabinsk and went until it hit the Ob River. Section 2 connected the other side of the river east to Irkutsk, and the third ran from Ulan-Ude in Buryatia to Vladivostok. Further sections were built to connect Europe with Siberia and south around Lake Baikal to avoid the use of ferries. Of course, they didn't immediately build the Lake Baikal section, so they did commission 2 ferries to make this trip, the SS Baikal and the SS Angara. They were ice-breaking train ferries that ran across the lake between the 2 ends of the Trans-Siberian twice a day to link the country. This was their stopgap before the southern route was completed. Believe it or not, this little factoid is relevant for this video. They also elected to, just ram the railroad straight through fucking China to connect to Port Arthur, but afterwards they built a separate northern route to serve as an alternative in case Manchuria ever got invaded. Knock on wood. This little factoid directly led to both the Boxer Rebellion and the Russo-Japanese War, but that's par for the course for Russian foreign policy. By late 1904, construction was essentially finished, just in time for said Russo-Japanese War. At over 9,000 kilometers, it is far and away the longest railroad in the world, and is nothing short of an engineering marvel. It definitely had its issues. It was single-tracked until the 1930s, which caused severe bottlenecks, and the entire line in the west was shifted north at one point, but overall it accomplished its goal. Siberia was now connected to the rest of Russia, and in the coming decades, population, agriculture, industry, and resource extraction would flourish in the vast landscape. So, with this information in mind, it's time to jump to something that is so different the Venn diagram circles are in separate rooms. Way to the west, there stood a land called Bohemia. I'll spare you like 2,700 years of admittedly incredibly interesting history, but just know that after the Western Slavs migrated and split, the lands of Bohemia, named for an old Celtic tribe, were settled by the people that came to be known as the Czechs. Bohemia became a kingdom, and then it was vored by the Habsburgs, who ruled it under personal union, and after the formation of the Austrian Empire, and later Austria-Hungary, it found itself essentially absorbed into Austria proper. Bohemia was one of the most important cultural and economic centers of the country, and later would become one of its most important industrial centers as well. However, it was still full of Czechs, who were notably not Germanic. This didn't exactly create social harmony in Bohemia, and there was a very large minority of Germans in the Sudeten regions. German was also the language of governance, and for the most part, the Czechs were considered by most to simply be Germans who talked funny, since they were so heavily influenced by the culture that literally surrounded them. Beginning in the late 1700s, and influenced by the emergence of Romanticism and the Enlightenment, as well as increasing Germanization decrees coming from Vienna, Czech intellectuals and elites pushed for a cultural and linguistic revival. Through the 1800s, heavily sponsored by the more culturally aware nobility, works of history, literature and artistic expression, and Czech-oriented cultural activities flourished. Efforts were also undertaken to promote the teaching of Czech in schools and focus on Czech history and culture in post-secondary institutions. As such, by the end of the 1800s, a nationalistic attitude was rapidly sweeping much of Bohemia, with Czech becoming a cohesive and distinct identity that the people could rally around for unity. Just down the street from the Czechs settled the Slovaks. The Czechs and Slovaks were quite similar, yet still quite distinct. Their languages are, for the most part, mutually intelligible, but from a cultural perspective, they diverge considerably in many ways. Much like the Czechs under the control of the Germans, the Slovak people, culture, and language weren't necessarily the top priority of their overlords, as it very gradually developed. The Hungarians, and everyone else who happened to control them, gave them a lot of autonomy in a sort of fuck off and we'll let you be way, which lasted until the Slovaks supported Austria during the Hungarian War of Independence in 1848, hoping for greater autonomy within the empire as a separate entity from Hungary. This didn't pan out because Austria, but they did gain some language autonomy. Despite this, the Hungarians had adopted a policy of soft assimilation of their minority groups, and as such, the Slovaks were fighting for their very existence for nearly a century. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s that the Slovak language as we know it would be properly codified. Coupled with their nobility being very much assimilated into Hungarian and German circles, the Slovak national revival was much slower than the Czechs, but it did still happen. Slovak national identity emerged in the face of Hungarian suppression as a method of saving their people from complete assimilation. For many, the plights of the Czechs and Slovaks created a sense of solidarity. Two West Slavic peoples who were subjugated by foreigners who saw them as simple extensions of imperial domination. Under Austria and Hungary, their aspirations as nations were limited by whatever the emperor declared. Wouldn't it be nice to chart our own course, some thought. As both nations saw their nationalist aspirations gradually rise over the course of the 1800s, a certain subset of these nationalist thinkers looked at the two and went, what if we stuck them together? And thus, Czechoslovakism was born. Now, Czechoslovakism didn't start as an independence idea. It was only given serious thought after World War I started. Instead, it was more of an anthropological thought experiment undertaken in universities and schools rather than serious political policy. The general idea was that the Czechs and Slovaks should unite into a singular state, which would allow for collective prosperity and defense in a way that could not be achieved if the two remained separate. It was spearheaded mostly by the Czechs because they had a more established sense of cultural identity, and the Slovaks were presently trying not to die. General discussion surrounding what it really meant to be a Slav gave way to thoughts about whether the Czechs and Slovaks were potentially one people, or one nation, or simply both small parts of the larger Slavic nation. What Czechoslovakism will eventually settle on is the idea that Czechs and Slovaks were one nation, that were bound by shared history and identity in many ways. However, this would have some quirks. Czechoslovakism was very much a Czech-dominated school of thought, and as such, the Slovak half of the Czechoslovak experiment was always the junior partner of the relationship, even before independence. Slovaks were underrepresented in both the legions and the future National Council, and the future state of Czechoslovakia really struggled to establish itself as a nation of equals. Slovak identity was also not as solid as Czech identity was, and to this end, the Czech thinkers believed that they could help uplift the Slovak people in a way. Slovakia also had a less developed industrial economy, and as such, the Czechs would hold significant economic power in a combined nation. This would naturally create resentment, as many Slovaks would come to feel that they were simply submitting themselves to Czech assimilation and economic domination after freeing themselves from Hungary. That said, the idea wasn't all bad. The two nations could definitely be stronger together, as their combined industrial bases would serve as a very strong starting position for shared prosperity. They were also both still Slavs, and many within Czech lands considered the Slovaks to be a brother nation of sorts, and vice versa. The two peoples already got along, so it wouldn't be that hard to convince them that mutual assistance would be beneficial to the safety and development of both parties. And to solve the cultural divide, Czechoslovakism called for the creation of a united Czechoslovak identity that existed beyond the two individual groups, to further break down the walls between the two. It was an idea that could potentially work if executed properly, but for right now, it was still just a thought experiment. Save for certain radical elements, most of these thinkers, the most notable of which being, of course, Tomáš Masaryk, believed the solution to the preservation of Czech and Slovak culture was federalizing the empire, granting Bohemia and Slovakia equal status to everyone else. Neither the Czechs nor Slovaks gave much thought to actual independence, as the framework for statehood simply didn't exist at that point. But beginning in the early 1900s and in the run-up to World War I, greater numbers of people started throwing around the I word. Austria-Hungary was unstable, and there was always a chance that the minorities of the empire would eventually be its undoing, and then they would have to rely on themselves for development and protection. And the idea that Czechs and Slovaks could be stronger together began to influence broader events in ways that would eventually spiral into these ideas becoming a reality. Okay, so we have a big-ass railway in Siberia and the emergence of nationalism in two groups of people that could not be further removed from it. These two topics may seem initially completely unrelated, but believe it or not, these timelines do converge, beginning with a certain Austrian archduke eating a faceful of lead on a random street in Sarajevo in 1914. Surely everyone watching this knows how World War I started at this point. God knows I've mentioned it in like 70% of my videos, so I'm gonna just jump to the part where Russia kicks the shit out of Austria-Hungary. Maybe one day we'll go in depth about Russia's World War I experience. Maybe. Russian military strategy didn't really revolve around actually conquering Austria-Hungary. Their main goal was to blow up the empire. As much as Stavka would have loved to march Russian boots through Vienna, the empire was big and dumb and multi-ethnic and had a large population that would not take kindly to occupation. And the Russians always saw Germany as their primary existential threat, which needed to be focused on with all available strength. As such, they sought to destroy the idea of Austria-Hungary. The nationalities of the empire were initially mostly supportive of the war, the conflict serving as a unifying force in a way. You know, forgotten Kaiser and all that. But if the empire could be decisively beaten and humiliated on the battlefield, then the nationalities would most likely start agitating and making demands for greater autonomy and rights in exchange for continued loyalty. If Russian victories against them outpaced the empire's ability to promise reforms and achieve promising gains on the battlefield, then the empire would most likely shatter. And if Austria-Hungary shatters, then Germany is alone and will die very quickly. So, whatever they could do to speed along the rise of nationalism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire would help the war effort considerably. We can see this in action very early on. The Russians smashed the ever-loving shit out of the Austro-Hungarian army in Galicia in the early months of the war, and the morale of the empire was permanently devastated. With these ideas in mind, the Russian government was approached with a petition. The Tsardom played the pan-Slavism card very early, declaring that this was now a war for the liberation and survival of the Slavic people in the face of the encroaching Germanic hordes. Russia was seen by almost all of the other Slavic nations as the leader of the Slavic world, and as such, there were very large numbers of Slavic expats of other nations. These expats were very willing to fight for the Tsardom if it meant helping out what they saw as their oppressed brothers. Among these expats were 140,000 Czechs and Slovaks, who themselves had formed small nationalist committees amongst those who believed in their independence. Now, I must stress that these were small. Most of these people didn't really care just yet, but Czechoslovakism took hold among enough of the population to warrant the formation of a small brigade at the end of August 1914. The Russians saw this as a win-win. It gave them more meat for the grinder and gave them the ability to potentially trigger a Czech and Slovak revolt in Austria-Hungary if the conditions were right. As such, the Russian military was tasked by the Tsar with setting up what came to be known as the Czech Battalion, the first formation of the Czechoslovak Legion. This brigade numbered a little over 1,000 men and was initially led by Russian officers, since recruitment was a lot lower than anticipated. That said, many important figures like Stanislav Čechek and Jan Shirovi would all be members of the battalion and would go on to distinguish themselves throughout the war. Politically, the nationalist societies united into the Union of Czechoslovak Societies in Russia, which would push for greater recruitment and handled most of the diplomacy between the legionaries and the Russian government. Initially, the Czechs and Slovaks were kept separate, but the doctrine of Czechoslovakism had taken hold amongst the nationalist expat circles, and pushes were made for the two peoples to fight as one as a bit of an experiment in practicality. There was a belief that a Czechoslovak nation and identity could be forged in iron and blood, and as we will come to see, history, this belief held some water. The unit was deployed to the southwestern front against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia. It was split into many smaller formations, spread amongst numerous other Russian units, and served primarily in scouting, intelligence, interrogation, and sabotage roles. Many of them fit in quite well amongst the Austro-Hungarian troops, and as such, they became adept at infiltrating and causing chaos behind enemy lines. Those times they did see direct combat, they performed quite well, fighting with a noted ferocity and discipline. They continued to fight constantly through 1915, and as news of their exploits spread, recruitment gradually ramped up. It was still super slow though, and the Union repeatedly requested to be allowed to recruit from the already trained and often very willing Czech and Slovak POWs sitting in Russian camps. But this was denied by the more conservative elements of the Russian government. Despite this, enough men had joined the ranks to reform the battalion into the 1st Czechoslovak Rifle Regiment, named for Jan Hus, in December of 1915. The following January, Tsar Nicky declared that the Czechoslovaks would receive the same rights and rewards as the regular Russian soldiers, which was also a huge boon. Recruitment rose further as a result, and in April, a full brigade of 3 regiments and 2,500 men was established. The brigade continued to prove itself a very capable fighting force. It took part in the Brusilov offensive in June to September of 1916, being commended by General Brusilov himself in his memoirs for their excellent fighting ability. This is when we finally acknowledge that Tomáš Masaryk exists, and this is about where he seriously enters the story. So, back in December of 1914, Masaryk went, hey, maybe independence could work, after the Austro-Hungarians got absolutely bent over a table, and he straight up fled the country to go organize a pro-Entente independence movement in December of 1914. The Czech and Slovak emigre communities were significantly more nationalist-minded than those who still lived in the empire at this point, and as such, almost immediately after the war started, national organizations started popping up in Entente countries, pledging support for their cause. Masaryk founded his own in Switzerland alongside another exile named Yusuf Dudic. With this start, Masaryk would go around gobbling up all of these small independent councils into his, because it would give them considerably more legitimacy as the representatives of the Czechs and Slovaks. In early 1916, enough organizations had been consumed for Masaryk to be confident in declaring the Czechoslovak National Council, and he issued a manifesto declaring war on Austria-Hungary in the name of a free Czechoslovakia. On this council, he was also joined by another Czech, Edvard Beneš, who we are just going to call E. Benes, if you know you know, and Milan Rastislav Stefanik, a guy with insane natural charisma and severe main character syndrome who would represent the Slovak half of the council. In 1916, Dudic went to Russia to try and bring the Union of Czechoslovak Societies into the fold, but he got distracted when the Tsar offered him a fuckload of funding if he established a parallel organization that would place post-war Czechoslovakia in the Russian sphere of influence. This caused a schism, which ended when the Tsar got overthrown and his money dried up. In mid-1917, Masaryk would travel to Russia to actually get the fucking job done, unifying the Russian organizations behind the National Council. The council subsequently took the Czechoslovak Brigade as its own, pushing for increased recruitment and support, hoping to turn them into a major fighting force that could serve as the backbone for a future national army. In the aftermath of the February Revolution, the Czechoslovak Brigade remained one of the few apolitical military formations and stood amongst even fewer that maintained most of their discipline and morale. As such, they would finally be reunified into a single cohesive formation for the Kerensky Offensive, marking the first time the Czechoslovaks fought together. Now numbering around 7,000 men, the brigade was tasked with small offensive actions in the area of Zborov. The battle that ensued in the first week of July would prove to be a nation-defining moment. The units they faced were primarily Hungarian, but they also had to engage in an unfortunate fratricide with a couple of Czech regiments attached to the 19th Infantry Division from the German regions of Bohemia. The Austro-Hungarians were significantly better equipped and better trained, and they had an extra 5,000 men numbers-wise. But the Czechoslovak Brigade proceeded to beat the shit out of them. The 4 regiments arrayed against them shattered completely, with the Czechoslovaks taking upwards of 4,000 prisoners. In this battle, Jan Shirovi would end up getting his eye shot out, and afterwards he would wear an absolutely kick-ass eye patch, drawing comparisons to Jan Žižka from basically everyone. In the grand scheme of the Kerensky Offensive, the battle itself was essentially irrelevant, but it became a symbol. Masaryk up in Petrograd immediately blasted news of this victory across every channel he could muster, granting the Czechoslovak Brigade and the National Council immediate fame and legitimacy it badly needed. Furthermore, this humiliating defeat at the hands of one of their constituent nationalities forced the Austrians to finally acknowledge the existence of the Czechoslovak formations fighting against them to their populace, and this caused the Czech and Slovak regions of the empire to just immediately begin destabilizing. Emboldened by the idea that freedom may now be attainable, Czech and Slovak resistance ramped up considerably. If this continued, the lid on the nationalism of the empire risked popping off completely. Of course, Russia wouldn't last long enough in its current state wait to see that occur. This performance gave the National Council the ammo required to finally get the Russian government to allow recruitment from Czech and Slovak prisoners of war. Recruitment skyrocketed compared to what it was, with 22,000 volunteers answering the call in the first couple months, allowing the Czechoslovak Brigade to be transformed into a full division. The first division of the Czechoslovak Corps in Russia, also known as the Czechoslovak Legion. They had so many recruits that through September and October a full second division was also raised, and they were given dedicated artillery and supply formations to ramp up their strength. However, these numbers were still somewhat disappointing. Less than 10% of new recruits were Slovaks for one, and they only made up about 20% of the Legion in total, which was bad optics for the force calling itself the Czechoslovak Legion. Furthermore, only about 25% of prisoners contacted actually volunteered, the majority of them being rather apolitical or simply not wanting to risk their lives for a cause they didn't necessarily believe in. Despite this, by December, the Legion numbered over 40,000 men, and by the spring of 1918, it numbered over 50,000. The Legion would eventually come to number in the ballpark of 60,000 fighting men, although this number waxed and waned with the military situation. In the aftermath of the disastrous Kerensky offensive and the chaos of the Kornilov Putsch, they were one of the few formations in the Russian army that remained almost completely combat effective. This would, of course, create an interesting dynamic a few minutes later when the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and Russia exploded again. The situation had become a little odd. The Czechoslovak Legion was now stuck in Ukraine, surrounded by a rapidly dissolving Russian army standing basically alone against the forces of the Central Powers. Well, fuck. Thankfully, for the moment, the front remained static, so they could focus their efforts on the Bolsheviks, who were now bitching at them. Throughout October, there were some brief battles with Bolshevik militias in the streets of Ukraine before a ceasefire could be hammered out. Then in December, the Bolsheviks signed a ceasefire with the Central Powers, and things got really tense. The National Council had a vested interest in the war continuing because they wanted Austria to die, and this created issues. The Bolsheviks initially politely requested that the Czechoslovaks just stay where they were, but this wasn't gonna happen. The empire they served no longer existed, therefore the only loyalty they held was to Czechoslovakia. The National Council decided to exploit a loophole and place the Legion under the jurisdiction of the French army, which allowed them to preserve their independence and give them the legal right to continue existing. The French also offered to dump money and guns into them so long as they continued to fight the Central Powers. The Bolsheviks also, for what it's worth, tacitly supported their continued existence as a sort of wild card to use against the Germans. So for a little over 3 months, the Legion sat in the area around Kiev and waited. As you would probably expect, this state of affairs created issues for just fucking everyone. There were 40,000 heavily armed, well-trained soldiers that were one of the only formations to have survived the collapse of the Russian army with their discipline and morale almost completely intact. There was essentially a gigantic mercenary army sitting around, and brother, they were not getting paid. They were basically an area hazard in central Ukraine. As such, they needed to be contended with by everyone. After Ukraine declared its independence, the Legion helped smash a couple of Bolshevik uprisings, after which the Central Rada was like, "Yo, do you want to help us fight the Bolsheviks?" And the Legion went, nah, we good. And the Ukrainians just had to fucking take that. They didn't have the state or military capacity to disarm them, so there was just a rogue army sitting in their lands that they couldn't get rid of. Then, when Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko invaded the country, he also just had to deal with this gigantic fuck-ass army sitting around. He definitely couldn't disarm them. The entire country was in chaos, and the Reds barely had the men to maintain control of the Russian hinterlands at this point. If the Czechoslovaks had decided to just march on Petrograd, they could probably just do it, and there wouldn't be much to stop them. As such, the Bolshevik invasion had to tiptoe around what was the military equivalent of a meth head that's been awake for 79 hours and is brandishing a sharp object. They could try and subdue the meth head, sure, but that would be a fight they would both lose. So Ovsienko elected to just ignore them and avoid eye contact for the moment while trying to negotiate them out of the country so they weren't his problem anymore. This state of affairs also created issues for peace negotiations at Brest-Litovsk, simultaneously fucking over both the Bolsheviks and the Ukrainians at the conference. The Central Powers, and especially Austria-Hungary, really didn't like a massive Entente-aligned army that was dedicated to destroying specifically Austria, so a portion of the negotiations revolved around getting rid of them. It basically came down to, you break them up or we come in and shoot them. And since the Bolsheviks had no ability to break them up, they settled on vague promises of kicking the Legion out of the country by sending them east, so they would hopefully take long enough to not be a problem for the Germans. The Germans were actually fine with this. The Austrians were less fine, but who gives a shit what they think. But the negotiations broke down before things were hammered out, so in their places the Legion remained. In February of 1918, the Germans launched Operation Faustschlag, sweeping east and seizing vast territories from the disorganized Bolsheviks. After watching the Bolsheviks die with alarming speed, the legionaries went, Okay, yeah, enough pissing around. On your feet, soldier, we are leaving. They had captured a bunch of armored trains that were kind of just sitting around, so they loaded up and hightailed it east. But alas, they were not fast enough. The Germans dominated the Reds, who folded like a house of cards. This had the chain reaction of catching the anarchists off guard, who also promptly folded and dispersed, leaving the Legion almost totally alone with a very pissed off army chasing them that really wanted to crush them utterly as the last major threat in the east and as traitors to the crown of Austria. The Austrians made a habit of summarily executing all captured Czechs and Slovaks as a show of force. If they could break the Legion, then maybe they could break nationalist aspirations in the Slavic provinces too. So, having broken the Bolsheviks and scattered the anarchists, the Germans approached the Legion expecting a similarly easy fight. Do it. Do it, pussy. Come on, Germany. Hit me. Hit me. The Germans caught the Legion at Bachmach, a critical rail junction in the northeast. The Germans moved to encircle the Legion, trapping them between the city and the Desna. Easy kill, right? Wrong. 1,000 years of Germanic military tradition was upended with the legionaries decimating the Germans. They broke out of the encirclement, repelled a dozen attacks holding the bridge over the Desna, and a dozen more holding the rail lines and Bachmach itself, and smacked the Germans so badly that they begged for a truce before fucking off back to their mud huts. They patiently waited for the Legion to reform itself and evacuate all of its forces before quietly marching into the city a few days later. The Legion was now 2-0 over the Central Powers, so they just threw in the towel and let them go. Unbelievably based. Anyways, the Legion succeeded in leaving Ukraine and began riding the rails to the east. They moved on to Kursk, and after some more negotiating, they had to negotiate with every single Soviet they came across, the Czechoslovaks would be permitted to take the Trans-Siberian Railway east towards Vladivostok to evacuate Russia. In exchange, they were forced to surrender some of their heavy weapons, which they agreed to. Ovsienko supervised the disarming and then waved the legionaries on their way. Before they made it past Moscow, however, Leon Trotsky was made the new commissar for war, and he had dramatically different ideas. Now he wanted the Legion to surrender all of its heavy weapons and most of its light ones, and throw all of the Russian officers out of their ranks. This was also agreed to, very tensely, on March 27th in the city of Penza, where the vanguard of the Legion had arrived. They gave up most of the arms, but the legionaries weren't stupid and feared Bolshevik treachery, so they secretly held on to some, just in case, as they moved into Siberia. The evacuation continued very, very slowly. The Bolsheviks really wanted the Czechoslovaks to join the Red Army, since they desperately needed professional soldiers, and as such spent a lot of time holding the Legion up at various points and sending agitators and propaganda into their ranks. This caused a portion of the more communist members of the Legion to defect over the course of April and May. This made the very anti-communist officers very suspicious of the Reds and their willingness to hold up their end of the bargain. Then, at the end of April, the German Count Mirbach arrived in Moscow, and then the legionaries got really nervous. Unsubstantiated rumors began to swirl about the Bolsheviks planning on disarming them so they could, fucking kill them and give their heads to the Central Powers. Word of a German and Austrian conspiracy with the Bolsheviks shot through the ranks, and they got very skittish. By the beginning of May, the Legion was strung out along the Trans-Siberian, with the first few squads arriving in Vladivostok, and as such, they were very vulnerable. And if that wasn't enough, the National Council got a fun little message from the British and the French that threw out the idea of the Legion actually staying in Russia to reopen the front against Germany. As this idea caught traction, the Legion suddenly became a pawn in their game, and they dragged their feet on actually sending ships to pick the Czechoslovaks up. The Entente then started talking with Trotsky, trying to reroute the legionaries west of the Urals up north to Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, where British troops had recently landed, splitting the Legion in two. The National Council went along with this, since it banked on Entente support to continue existing, much to the chagrin of the Legion and its commanders. It was a whole fucking shit show, and everyone by this point figured that their trip out of the country would be interrupted. And interrupted it was. After Adam and Simonov's raids in Transbaikalia and Japanese troops landing in Vladivostok, the trains were stopped by the Bolsheviks for like the fourth fucking time. Tensions were high when the Bolsheviks told the Legion it was being split up like the Entente wanted. Their commanders had notably not been informed of this before the Reds started demanding it, and they were starting to get a little bit pissed. Furthermore, discipline amongst the Czechoslovak soldiers was beginning to dwindle. They were alone in a hostile land, far from home and any hope of supply or reinforcements. They were constantly bombarded bombarded with communist propaganda, harassed by local Red Guards, and were completely exposed and disunited. They were backed into a corner and terrified that the Reds would betray them and send them all to Austria, where they would all be hanged as traitors. But it seemed like the Reds would actually let them go, despite all of these stoppages. What could cause this situation to boil over? Who could possibly antagonize the Czechs and Slovaks and provoke them into an irrational action that would risk causing this whole situation to spiral out of It was the Hungarians. Details about this incident vary, but on May 14th in the city of Chelyabinsk, a train of Hungarian prisoners traveling west to be repatriated to Austria-Hungary ended up stopping. Remember, the Trans-Siberian was still only single-tracked at this point, meaning it was only one way. So the legionaries were already pissed that they were stuck while their literal war enemies got easy passage. Initially, things seemed okay, with the legionaries giving the POWs some of their cigarettes after a little bit of small talk. However, ethnic tensions run deep, and one of the Hungarians threw a rock at a Slovak, hitting him on the head and knocking him out. That Hungarian was promptly lynched. His buddies were beaten to within an inch of their lives, and a small skirmish ensued, which was broken up by the Bolsheviks. They arrested the group of legionaries they considered responsible, and when a delegation was sent to the prison to demand their release, the delegation was also arrested. Upon learning of this, the legionaries went mad. They mobilized their troops and stormed the city arsenal, looting weapons and ammunition before marching on the prison, freeing their comrades and burning it to the ground. They then drove away a Bolshevik counterattack, disarmed the Red Guards, fought off the Hungarians, and seized control of the city facilities. The Legion would bow to no one. They were going to get the fuck out of Russia, come hell or high water. Admittedly, the regional Bolshevik authorities tried to settle things amicably, getting the legionaries to stand down, and it looked for a moment that this incident would be swept under the rug. But when Moscow learned of the ordeal, they started screaming for blood. Trotsky finally had his excuse to liquidate the area hazard, and he leapt at the chance. The National Council representatives in Moscow were arrested, and Trotsky ordered the Legion to lay down its arms. He also ordered the local Soviets in Siberia to seize their trains and arms and place them under arrest. This coincided with a Congress of Czechoslovak commanders held in Chelyabinsk, where, in light of these developments and the creeping thought that the Reds wouldn't let them leave, they voted unanimously in favor of rejecting the Entente's plan of splitting the Legion. Then, after a request from the imprisoned council members came from Moscow demanding that the Legion lay down their arms, this too was refuted. The Legion made its stand. They didn't fight for Russia or Britain or France or even the National Council. They fought for Czechoslovakia. Čeček basically looked at the Entente representatives and went, "We're gonna do what's best for us. You can help us or get the fuck out of our way." And when asked how the Legion planned to do that, the response was simply,
"Thought I'd try shooting my way out. Mix things up a little."
The Congress passed a defiant resolution, essentially saying, "You want our guns, Trotsky? Come and take them." On May 25th of 1918, Trotsky sent a telegram to local forces along the Trans-Siberian, declaring that the Czechoslovaks were to be disarmed and scattered with force if necessary, and if they couldn't be disarmed, then all measures must be taken to prevent their further retreat east. Any Legion unit found bearing arms was to be thrown in a prison camp or executed on the spot. On May 26th, an explosion of fighting began along the Great Railway from Penza to Irkutsk, as the legionaries overwhelmingly refused to submit to Bolshevik domination and inevitable annihilation. The revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion had begun. Going directly against French orders to lay down their arms, the legionaries fought ferociously against attempts to disarm them. Despite being strung out across thousands of kilometers, the Legion retained its morale, although discipline eroded rather rapidly as the fear of being captured became overwhelming. Furthermore, the seizure of Chelyabinsk effectively severed Bolshevik ability to communicate with or effectively reinforce their units in Siberia, and as such, the Czechoslovaks quickly overpowered attempts at resistance. However, the Czechoslovaks were heavily divided by distance, and as such, they desperately needed to connect their forces or risk defeat in detail. As such, the legionary army was divided into 4 rough command zones for the moment. Stanislav Čeček led the men west of the Urals, Jan Shirovy led those in western and central Siberia, Radola Gadja from Novonikolaevsk to Irkutsk, and a Russian general who had joined them, Mikhail Dieterich, commanded the legions east of Lake Baikal. The primary objective was seizing control over the entire length of the railroad and dynamiting the Reds out of their path so that all of their comrades in arms could escape. The sudden emergence of 60,000 feral hogs in the form of well-armed and pissed-off anti-Bolshevik troops, also empowered other anti-Bolshevik forces in the regions around the railway. As such, militias affiliated with national minorities, as well as the suppressed monarchists, liberals, and socialist revolutionaries, also came out of the woodwork to support the Legion as their liberators. In Zlataust, the legionaries seized major buildings and focused on defending the rail lines. In this endeavor, they were joined by a large number of Bashakirs who helped them drive the Reds out of the city by early June. On May 26, the SRs of Omsk and surrounding towns rose up and established a Siberian government, which allied itself with the legions. In early June, the legionaries launched a pincer movement from Omsk and Chelyabinsk to seize control over Kurgan and Petropavlovsk, while other forces marched east to link up with Gaja's troops in Novonikolaevsk. Back in the west, Czech's forces, situated in the area around Penza, found themselves totally cut off from their Siberian comrades by hundreds of kilometers. Facing encirclement, Czech assaulted Penza and took it on the 29th, then began the relentless march east towards Samara. On the 31st, advance units took the bridge over the Volga at Sirzhan, then took Bezenchuk after a brief skirmish. These battles around the Volga are notable for being largely Czech-on-Czech violence, as the Czechoslovak communist factions broke away from the legions after their attempts at proselytizing failed. The Bolsheviks attempted to halt and destroy the legion at the Lipyagi railway station on June 4th, for which Czech absolutely fucking slaughtered them by pulling a sneaky little maneuver which bypassed Red defenses and caused them to crumble. The few Bolshevik survivors arrived in Samara, and the city collapsed into anarchy, which the legionaries capitalized on, bulldozing their way into the city the following day. On the 8th, local SRs and anti-Bolshevik officers declared the re-establishment of the deposed Constituent Assembly, called the Directory, or the Komuch, and on the 13th in Omsk, the Provisional Siberian Government was declared. The rearguard of the Legion evacuated Penza some days later, and forward units launched a drive on Ufa, where another uprising had taken place. The following month, on July 6th, the western echelons of the Legion finally linked up with those in western Siberia in the town of Minyar, completing the occupation of the western Trans-Siberian. Back in the east, after routing the Bolsheviks at Mariinsk, Krasnoyarsk would be abandoned and taken by the Legion on June 20th, after which Gaja marched on Irkutsk, which he had been forced to abandon a month prior due to the intervention of Entente negotiators. Irkutsk would fall without a fight on July 14th. He then had the unenviable task of marching south around Lake Baikal, where the Bolsheviks destroyed hundreds of kilometers of track and threatened to blow up the train tunnels that were the only way through the mountains and hills. From a military perspective, the Legion were in a league of their own in the chaos that was Russia. They made quite brilliant use of the armored train to spearhead their offensive, something that was uniquely well suited to combat along the Trans-Siberian. Remember, it was single-tracked, so if you strap armor, artillery, and a big-ass plow to your train for maximum penetration, you can bulldoze basically anything in your path, smashing right through enemy lines, trains, barricades, etc. And when the enemy is softened, hundreds of legionaries could flood out of the trains to strike at their heart. Insane distances could be covered with impressive speed, and oftentimes the Czechoslovaks would move so fast that they would overrun Bolshevik formations and beat them to the towns. And many a time, the Bolshevik troops would have their nerves break at the sight of the Legion arriving, and they would shatter completely. Like, imagine if you were a Bolshevik Red Guard. You haven't had a solid meal in weeks, and you are getting antsy as the only action you've had is shooting the occasional partisan, despite hearing about absolute chaos in the West. Suddenly, you see Jan Chadinsky barreling down the railway at Mach fuck at the helm of his tactical assault bunker. He hasn't been sober since 1914, and he has enough guns to demolish your entire town. You would probably crack and run away too. The simple strategy of load up the trains, rush to the next town, wreck everything, and repeat proved brilliant and devastating. And, of course, the Legion's advances were kept up through plundering the arsenals and armories in the towns that they captured. The Legion just kept winning and winning, leaving their opponents broken, scattered, and thoroughly penetrated, while putting on full display the sheer power of railways in modern warfare. If nothing else, the Czechoslovaks vindicated the fuck out of the designers of the railway, and proved just how critical the Trans-Siberian would be for Russia as a country. Gone was the slow 6 to 8 month march from Moscow to Vladivostok. In its place was a couple of weeks by rail. Of course, just because they were winning didn't mean they weren't also incredibly brutal. This is the Russian Civil War, after all. We have to get our daily ration of war crimes in there. For his part, Gaja was by far the most brutal of the legionary commanders, taking 0 prisoners and engaging in several mass executions targeting both Bolsheviks and German, Austrian, and Hungarian POWs. Elsewhere along the line, there too were large casualties, with the Czechoslovaks rounding up and killing large numbers of Bolshevik troops and officials in pretty much every city they took over. Hungarians and Germans were deliberately deliberately targeted and subject to torture and wholesale slaughter. Those killed were perhaps luckier than most of the people taken prisoner by the Legion, who were often loaded onto trains with limited food, water, sanitation, fuel, and clothing, and shipped east. Tens of thousands of prisoners would perish in these death trains, with huge numbers freezing to death in the frigid Siberian winters. Of course, this wasn't a zero-sum game. The Bolsheviks made a habit of summarily executing every single legionary they captured, and they partook in several mass murders of their own directed at the Czechoslovaks. Russian Civil War, everyone. In the extreme Far East, things were initially very quiet for most of May and June. Over 13,000 legionaries were in Vladivostok by this point, and the local Soviets supported the evacuation because they really didn't want to deal with this shit. There were also already 5,000 Japanese troops in Vladivostok attempting to keep the peace, but they allowed the local Soviet to remain in charge and mostly stuck to the port areas. However, neither side trusted each other, and as Gaja became bogged down in a series of miserable battles against dug-in Bolshevik troops, conflict was almost inevitable. In mid-June, the National Council and the Entente representatives in the city determined that the men in Vladivostok were needed in the west, because for them, evacuation was no longer the goal. The legionaries were pissed about this, but they also had nothing better to do since the Entente clearly had no intention of sending them ships at the moment, so they elected to say, fuck it, we ball. On June 29th, Deteriks and his men staged a coup in the city, toppling the Soviet and seizing control. Deteriks then began marching back west to link up with Gaja, fighting a bloody battle at Nikolsk, now Ussurisk, on July 5th. However, the Bolsheviks in the Far East were much more disciplined and were better equipped and trained, and they had a large number of Austrian, Hungarian, and German POWs that dreaded being on the receiving end of Czechoslovak massacres, so they were able to make a fierce stand in the Baikal and Amur regions, causing efforts to link the fronts to stall out. This whole shit show had the butterfly effect of probably extending the Russian Civil War by an entire 2 fucking years. The Bolsheviks up to the point of the uprising had done a pretty okay job at maintaining control of Siberia, but by July 10th, their authority had all but disintegrated. That big-ass railway that the Tsarists had spent nearly 15 years building turned out to be basically the only effective way in and out of the region, and as such, the Bolsheviks basically couldn't maintain their authority. Scattered forces remained in towns separated from the railway and in the Far East, but their only strong points were in Tyumen and Ekaterinburg, both of which the Legion now had in its sights. And the Legion kicked some ass, too. Turns out that big-ass mercenary army was good at fighting, and they beat the shit out of the undisciplined Bolsheviks with very little difficulty. Now, since the Czechoslovaks were waiting for the Entente to get off their asses and bring ships to Vladivostok, they figured they might as well help the whites they had just spawned into existence and try and accomplish the secondary objective of reopening the Eastern Front of World War I. Despite their masterful victories, the legionary leadership still felt they needed to buy some time. You don't evacuate a massive army 5,000 kilometers by train in an afternoon, after all, especially when that train can only run one direction at a time. Furthermore, the Western powers were absolutely adamant about reopening the Russia front to take pressure off of France, and as such, the Legion was essentially told it wasn't going anywhere for the moment. As such, the action shifted into a more openly offensive direction, but Czechoslovak roles in these offensives were more limited. Beginning on July 10th, Shirovi's forces pushed north, taking Tyumen and then moving on Ekaterinburg. Ekaterinburg was the place that the Russian royal family was being held. Now, whether or not the Czechoslovaks actually knew this is debated, but regardless, the Bolsheviks got skittish and murdered the entire royal family, dumping their bodies to prevent them from being saved and potentially used against them. A week later, the Legion captured the city after a brief battle. Over in the west, the legionaries, now considerably demoralized at the prospect of having to go back west, were sent under command of one Colonel Schwech with the People's Army of Komuch under Vladimir Kapel to force the Volga from the other direction at Simbirsk on July 22nd, then swinging north to launch a pincher on Kazan. After beating the Reds in open battle twice, the city was systematically encircled through several strategic river crossings. The Latvian riflemen almost routed 2 battalions of the Legion, but they were saved by the timely betrayal of all things, a fucking Serbian battalion of international volunteers which defected to the Czechoslovaks and forced the Latvians back. Kazan fell on the 7th, and interestingly, with it fell the entire imperial gold reserve. Now, there is a legend that the Czechoslovaks were the ones to find it, hold onto it, and eventually shipped it back to Czechoslovakia after pulling off the heist of the century, but that is not true, unfortunately. The Legion gave it to Kolchak and held onto it until the Bolsheviks came close to winning, afterwards handing it over as a show of goodwill as a part of their truce negotiations. Boring, I know. The final big scuffle to occur happened in the Far East. Gaja was busy trying to clear out the region around Lake Baikal, which was held by a lot of very stubborn Bolshevik troops. The second half of July saw a long series of careful battles for control of the tunnels and towns on the south coast, including one tunnel that had been blown up, which Gaja had cleared by handing his men pickaxes and shovels and telling them to mine their way through it. He also brought up some Bolshevik POWs to work as slave labor to bolster their numbers. This took 3 entire weeks, and they were constantly harassed by Bolshevik gunboats on the lake. Remember Baikal and Angara? Well, the Bolsheviks had taken over all the steamships in the lake and strapped artillery and machine guns to them, which would prove a serious issue. Angara was shelling the tunnel miners near constantly, needing to be warded off with artillery of their own installed on the railway track. When the legionaries captured the port of Listvianka, they captured 2 different steamships and also strapped artillery to them. Gaja looked at this and went, well, when life gives you lemons, right? And decided to become the first and only admiral of the first and only Czechoslovak naval flotilla to exist. Now, History of Everything has a very good video on this particular shit show, which I highly recommend if you want a more detailed look at what came to be called the Battle of Lake Baikal. But what matters for this video is that the Czechoslovak Navy went to go attack the harbor of Mizovsk, now Babushkin, on August 16th. They looked at the red ships in the harbor and went, "Sit yo bitch ass down." The harbor was destroyed, the train station that was their primary target was destroyed, Baikal exploded and ran aground, Angara was mogged and run off, and dozens of Bolshevik soldiers were killed. Czechoslovakia has a 100% naval combat win rate. The absolute Chads. With this victory and the clearing of the tunnel, the legionaries utilized their naval superiority to launch raids behind enemy lines with the help of their White Russian allies, and eventually routed the Bolsheviks completely at the cost of very high casualties. Verkhnyoydinsk fell on the 20th, with Chita being taken a few days later, which had the ripple effect of crippling morale in the eastern areas facing Deteriks, who had spent the last month slowly grinding towards Khabarovsk. And a week later, the 2 parts of the Legion were able to meet up, successfully conquering the entire length of the world's longest railway. They had done it. 9,000 kilometers. It took 350 years for the Russian Empire to conquer Siberia and the Far East. The Czechoslovak Legion did it in 3 months. Ghost Division who? Sabaton, where the fuck is the power metal ballad about the Legion? Well, regardless, the revolt had been nothing short of a masterstroke of strategy despite how chaotic it was. After this, the Legion commanders took a step back and went, well, now what? With the Trans-Siberian under control and Entente troops flooding into Siberia, Legion combat operations slowed dramatically. Willingness amongst the troops to keep fighting was rather limited. At this point, they had done their job, and they just wanted to get the fuck out. But that didn't stop the Entente from ordering all of them back west and blocking attempts of sending ships to go get them. Furthermore, the Reds in the west had reorganized. The furthest echelons of the Legion over in Samara, Kazan, and Simbirsk would be driven back by Trotsky and Tukhachevsky, which put everyone on edge at the thought of actually losing this conflict after all of that shit they had just done. And, of course, their morale was not helped by the White Russian armies squabbling like school children for most of the year. This was followed by the Entente recognizing the Czechoslovak National Council as the legitimate government of the future Czechoslovak state, and on October 28th of 1918, after what was essentially a coup in Prague, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, the Declaration of Independence of Czechoslovakia was read out on Wenceslas Square. As we know, on November 11th, World War I ended, Czechoslovakia was free, the empire effectively ceased to exist, and most notably, Germany was out. The Czechoslovak Legion suddenly had zero reason to be in Russia anymore. There was no more need for another front. This caused what morale did exist to collapse fully, and combined with the recent Bolshevik victories and the severe casualties suffered by the legionaries to nearly cause the Legion to split. The 1st Division in the West mutinied, causing Čeček to be removed from command and Colonel Švec to commit suicide. The 2nd Division of Gaja, which had been sent west to the Urals after their success in Baikal, also threatened mutiny, but this was suppressed with a violent crackdown and a mass execution. By the end of World War I, the fighting ability of the Legion had waned dramatically, and now they just wanted to go home. They were just pulling out of Ufa when suddenly Kolchak. He overthrew the Omsk Directory on November 18th and established dictatorial rule. He notably did not like the Czechoslovaks very much. He figured they were politically unreliable, and that they would turn on him if it meant getting out of the country, so he was very sparing in his usage of them. The Legion was also suffering from increasingly severe desertions and discipline issues. They had offered to help the Directory suppress the coup in Omsk, but the SRs refused, as the Russian population more broadly was also beginning to resent the Legion for fucking around. It was a two-way street, because the Legion also hated Kolchak for being anti-democratic and a tyrant. The White Armies were also busy conducting terror campaigns on the population of Siberia, slaughtering thousands of people for shits and giggles, which alarmed the Czechoslovaks quite severely. This dislike also meant that Kolchak didn't do much to help, as the legionaries in the Urals had the shit kicked out of them as they were dying en masse of disease and frostbite. Eventually, after Legion commanders protested the treatment of moderate socialists by the Whites and the Cossacks, they were withdrawn from the front. The Legion was sent to guard the section of the Trans-Siberian between Novonikolaevsk and Yakutsk against partisans, and just sit on their hands away from Omsk. The Legion was also, of course, growing restless. Stefanik had been in Siberia for a while trying to rally the legionaries, but they essentially told him to piss off, and any leader that followed him was treated similarly if they even suggested the prospect of going back to the front lines. The situation was not helped when Stefanik sacked Dieterix, who was universally beloved by the legionaries under his command. In January of 1919, he would return to the west to go lobby for more support from the French and to help the state building of the new Czechoslovak Republic. In June, the troops threatened to mutiny again, this time needing to be suppressed by several arrests. Gaja had also fucked off to go join the Russian army, and it became increasingly clear that they wouldn't march anymore. This coincided with Kolchak's armies getting their asses kicked and being driven over the Urals in the summer of 1919, which caused everyone to freak out even more. This is where Winston Churchill makes a cameo, because of fucking course he does, this guy is bloody everywhere. He was starting to get pissed at Kolchak for being incompetent, but he still supported intervention to stop the Reds. So he went to Ibanez and gave him a proposal so fucking absurd only a true paradox map gamer could have possibly come up with it. Churchill presumably railed a line of the purest coke money could buy and hit Ibanez with, okay, put half of the entire fucking legion in one mega death stack and march them straight through the Bolshevik lines and go towards Arkhangelsk, and tell them to blow up everything in their way. It'll allow the legions to escape Russia and will cripple the Bolsheviks. It's fucking foolproof. Ibanez, in between stifling bouts of laughter, did forward this to Shirovi, who also promptly laughed and told Churchill to shove the plan up his alcoholic ass. The Legion's time in this stretch of the rail was remarkably stagnant, which only made them more restless. They basically had a state that existed solely out of rail cars. Lodgings, entertainment facilities, banks, shops, medical facilities, and government apparatus all existed within the confines of boxcars. The legionaries lived a boring life of cramped spaces, limited light, humid summers, frigid winters, and disease. They were going fucking stir crazy, and the odd time they did encounter partisans, they could never stop all of them, causing Kolchak to throw his ire at the legionaries because they could be easily scapegoated. Eventually, partisan attacks in their section stopped, because the Legion went and negotiated with the partisans so that both sides could pretend the other didn't exist and move on with their lives. All this as Russian resentment grew. They hated the Legion for being well organized and supplied in the face of a military disaster. They hated the Legion for asserting some economic control over the mines and factories they took. And of course, they hated the Legion for fucking huge numbers of women, many of whom would elope with Czechoslovak officers and flee the country with them. As the tide turned against the Whites, the Legion was scapegoated for their failures even further, being called cowards for not needlessly throwing their lives away against the advancing Red armies, despite being ordered to stay where they were. And then, as the French vacillated on whether or not to actually help the Legion evacuate, Omsk would fall to the Reds in November of 1919. Following this, everyone figured out that the Whites in Siberia were toast, so on the 13th, Legion commanders signed a manifesto disavowing the Kolchak regime. This caused Kolchak to fly off the handle, calling the legionaries traitors and Bolsheviks in league with their enemies. Then, on the 17th, Gaja would reappear in Vladivostok. He had also disavowed the Whites and joined the SRs in the Far East, and he led a revolt in the city, which was crushed easily, and he was beaten to an inch of his life and exiled from Siberia. The straw that finally broke the camel's back was the absolute flood of refugees that hit the legionary-controlled rail lines. The Whites essentially demanded that the Legion stay where it was and wait around to be overrun and die, while the remnants of the Siberian White armies got priority access east as they ran away with their tails between their legs. If Kolchak had his way, the Czechoslovaks would be left to the mercy of the Bolsheviks, and likely massacred to the man in retribution for their revolt the year prior. This would not do. With the Allies continuing to drag their feet on pulling the Legion out, Shirovi elected to say fuck it. As such, the Legion revolted again. They took control of all the infrastructure along the Trans-Siberian, forcefully removing all Russians from their posts, then taking the Russian trains off of the lines and saying, "We are fucking leaving and you can't do shit to stop it." This finally made the Entente give up, and they finally allowed for a formal evacuation from Siberia and began sending ships to go pick them up. The flight east became a war for self-preservation, and the Czechoslovaks held the cards and the guns, so they got priority, leaving thousands of refugees at the mercy of the Bolsheviks behind them. The new revolt coincided, once again, with SR revolts across the railway, which quickly entered negotiations with the Legion, and the two sides did not fight. Enraged, Kolchak effectively declared war on Czechoslovakia and the Legion. When Adam and Simonov threatened the legionaries as they transited into Transbaikal, Shirovi basically went, "Get out of the way, or we will move you." Simonov tried to fight the Legion, got his ass handed to him, and was promptly moved out of the way. At the end of December 1919, Irkutsk fell to the SR rebels, who also allowed the Legion safe access to the city. During all of this, Kolchak was stuck in Nizhnoinsk, his trains having been diverted in favor of the Czechoslovaks. Convinced that Kolchak had ordered Simonov to attack them, the local legionaries placed him under house arrest in his train car. After most of his bodyguards defected to the insurgents, he was shoved in a different train car along with all of the imperial gold reserves from Kazan and shuffled east under Czechoslovak escort. However, they were running out of time. In early January of 1920, the pursuing Bolsheviks overran the Polish, Romanian, and Serbian units that were trailing them, and on the 13th, the Czechoslovaks clashed with advanced units of the Red Army once again. Kolchak's train entered Irkutsk on the 15th, and after some tense deliberation, the choice was made to hand him and the gold over to the SRs. A week later, the SRs ceded power to a Bolshevik committee, which on February 7th would put Alexander Kolchak before a firing squad. Using this as leverage, the Legion was able to negotiate with the pursuing Red Army, after repeatedly kicking the shit out of them for good measure. On the same day of Kolchak's execution, the Reds and the Legion would sign an armistice, with safe passage east guaranteed. By this point, white forces east of Lake Baikal had all but disintegrated, and the Reds were exhausted from a year of continuous fighting through the Urals and Siberia, so their leadership was fully ready to let them go. If nothing else, they had earned it, through blood and iron. By March 1st, the last Legion train had left Irkutsk, and after a brief skirmish with some upstart Japanese, the Legion began evacuating en masse. The last ship left Vladivostok in September of 1920. All in all, 67,750 people would be evacuated. Altogether, the Legion had suffered over 4,000 dead and thousands more desertions, as well as over 10,000 wounded. The first thing many of these people felt when finally boarding the ships bound for their now free homeland was overwhelming relief. The Legion had done it. They had survived the Siberian Anabasis. The Legions had a very arduous voyage around the backside of the planet in order to get back home. There were several routes they ended up taking, the most interesting of which to me is the 9,000 of the evacuees that would land in the port of Vancouver in British Columbia, and would take the Canadian Pacific Railway east across Canada to the army base at Valcartier in Quebec. From there, they were sent on to Halifax, where they boarded ships bound to Germany. They made quite the splash in every community they stopped in, exchanging gifts and participating in activities with local Canadians as they passed through. They also came across the water with several big-ass Siberian brown bears which found their way into assorted zoos. The Czechoslovaks were remarkably disciplined and their morale was high, and they carried out their journey without incident, save for one where a squad was left behind at one of their stops because they went out to sightsee. The human urge to just go see cool shit strikes again. I can't imagine most of these guys were particularly stoked at the prospect of crossing the world's second biggest country by train after they had just spent 2 years crossing the world's biggest country by train, but nobody was shooting at them this time, so they remained cheerful. By the end of July, the last of the Legion in Canada had left for home, leaving behind a quirky little story, a lot of Russian alcohol, and 8 fucking bears. In the years following, many of the men who made this transit would end up returning to Canada as immigrants, making their homes amongst the people that had probably restored their faith in humanity after the chaos that was Russia. To this day, Canada boasts nearly 70,000 Slovaks and 100,000 Czechs scattered across the country. By December of 1920, the entire Czechoslovak Legion in Russia had been repatriated to Czechoslovakia, where they now had the arduous task of nation building. Many members of the Legion would go on to hold high postings in the country, and the Legion itself, along with those that had fought in France and Italy, would form the backbone of the new Czechoslovak army. Masaryk would be elected the first president of Czechoslovakia, a post he would hold until 1935. He would die 2 years later, so he just missed having his dream be executed in front of him. He was replaced by Ibenis until his resignation after the Munich Diktat in 1938. Stefanik was dead. The plane he was on crashed, killing him on May 4th of 1919. Gaja would survive his ordeal, going on to become the chief of staff in the new army. He would also help found assorted Czech fascist parties because funny. He would eventually join the resistance in World War II, however, but his efforts were for naught, and he was suppressed by the communists and died broke and irrelevant in 1948. Čeček was on one of the last boats out of Siberia, going on to hold several major military positions until his death in 1930. Shirovi also returned to fanfare, holding many positions until he was shanghaied into the Prime Minister's office after the Munich crisis, and his failure to address it properly destroyed his reputation in the eyes of the people of the country. Despite not being a Nazi collaborator, he was tried as one anyway, and spent a decade in prison before being amnestied, dying in 1970 disgraced and penniless. Yeah, sorry to burst your bubble, there aren't many happy endings in this story. Czechoslovakia from its inception was fractured. The issues mentioned way back in Chapter 2 proved to be particularly difficult difficult to overcome. The Czechoslovak idea was very much a Czech idea, and many Slovaks would have preferred actual independence. Many Slovaks felt as though the Czechs were simply another Hungary, and the Slovak half of the nation did lag behind the Czechs economically and socially for a very long time. Masaryk tried his best to promote the idea of a united Czechoslovak people that existed beyond either individual ethnicity, which worked to some extent, and the nation did stick together for quite a while, all things considered. Czechoslovakia was still a very prosperous state, even with all these fundamental divisions. In the years leading up to the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was one of Europe's strongest industrial and economic powers, with a comparatively fairly strong army and network of alliances to back that up. So Czechoslovakia did work, but ultimately the problems with nationalism and its difficulties bridging the divide between the Czechs and Slovaks would be its undoing. The large German and Hungarian minorities were also not fans of the regime and did not have autonomy, which meant the country was always contending with separatism and nationalist factions supported by their neighbors. Close enough, welcome back Austria-Hungary. The legionaries could only watch as the country they tried to forge in blood and iron was dragged down and torn apart by the Germanic barbarians who exploited Slovak nationalism and pan-Germanism to dismember the country. After the Czechoslovak people were abandoned and left to die by their supposed Western allies, whom the Legion had fought, bled, and died for only 20 years prior. A fascist Slovak puppet state was established, with the Slovaks fleeing one perceived oppressor just to land in the arms of another. The lands of both Bohemia and Slovakia were devastated by the Second World War. Many of the legionaries took to their arms once again and joined the resistance movements, causing sizable damage to the German war effort, but the Germs slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Czechs during their occupation. And after the Slovaks revolted against the Germans in 1944, they too were subject to horrific repression. Following the end of the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was restored under an essentially enforced authoritarian communist rule after E. Benes died in 1948. This did not cool tensions between the Czechs and Slovaks, but they did eventually find unity in their dislike for their foreign occupiers. The legacy of the Legion was awkward for communist authorities, and as such, its existence was stamped out. The legacy of their Siberian campaign, their victories against the Bolsheviks, and their role in post-independence Czechoslovakia were scrubbed, and commanders and figures from the Legion were smeared, jailed, or stripped of significance. It wouldn't be until late in the 20th century, as Czech and Slovak nationalism flared up against the Soviets, that the Legion became a symbol to rally around. Even after the failure of the Czechoslovak experiment and the breakup of the country in 1992, the Legion and its leaders attained the status of heroes in the eyes of many. Memorial sites are dotted around the two countries, and the Legion is recognized as one of the driving forces behind Czech and Slovak independence. Czechoslovakia may have been an idealistic experiment that ended in failure, but the Legion was a tangible force that showed what the two nations were truly capable of when they worked together. Ultimately, they fought, bled, and died to free their brothers and sisters in binds, and as such, their legendary journey has since achieved a well-deserved mythical status in the annals of military history. Big shout out to the soldiers of the Spartan Brigade over on my Patreon. You guys help keep the Trans-Siberian Railway secure. An extra special shout out, of course, goes to Ukrainian Shadow Government, Charles Zhalak, Peter Bardos, Ministry of Autismus Affairs, Wolf Commissar, Jonathan Hernandez, Cheese122, A Normal Cow 5, Black Mare, Andrew Deffenbach, Jay, Ray Nertz, Ouch That Hurt, Seor, Harper's Ferry Blues, Ziam Z, Greek Nationalist, A Flag and Anthem Guy, Price, The Oil Master, Gangdolf Bangdolf, Arabian Nights, Kim, Ask89, Codename Titan Zebra, L. Walter Doro, Protector of the Faith and General Secretary of the National Salvation Council, I Ratman, Billiam Bones, CT Oldsmobile, Comrade Cosmo, Clever Riley 9, WLF 251, and Jimmy Legs. If you too would like to ride across the Siberian wastes fighting everyone in your path, consider joining my Patreon. Tiers 2 and 3 get access to the Spartan Journal, extra content every month. And on that note, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.